Have you guys ever seen one of these? Or these? I'm sure you have. They're called smartwatches, and they're basically tiny little computers that you can strap to your wrist. And when you think about it, that's pretty insane. To put in perspective, this smartwatch is about double the processing power of the original iPhone. So today, we'll be teaching you to create a basic app for Android Wear, a smartwatch platform. We'll be using Android Studio, the official and one of the most popular development environments for Androids. We'll be coding using Java and XML for the layouts. We'll also be becoming familiar with some of the APIs that make up Android Wear. Today, we'll be teaching you how to create this, a convenient notes app on your Wear device. Since wearables don't have any keyboards, we'll be teaching you how to use a voice input to create these notes. And also, we'll also be teaching you how to create a delete screen specific to Android Wear devices. Now let's get started. And our Marshmallow friend here in the corner will be helping us as we progress, covering the topics listed here. So let's download Android Studio and then let's hand it over to Ben to begin code.
So now that we've installed Android Studio, we can go ahead and create a new project. Make sure to type in the application name Notes. Make sure to check this checkbox, which allows us to use wearable components, and then just accept all the defaults and finish. So before we get started, I'm going to show you how to set up an Android Wear emulator. So go up here and press this button up here for the Android Virtual Device Manager. Press Create Virtual Device, switch it to Wear, and make sure you select the default one. Click the default one, which you might have to download, and then press Finish. Now after the AVD has finished being created, you can just go to the first one and press play, and the emulator will start. Okay, so now we're done with the emulator, we can start looking at the structure of the app. You'll notice that there's two modules on the left, a mobile module and a Wear module. So since we're only concerned with the part that will run on the Android Wear device, we'll have a look at the Android Wear code. So if we open up the Java file, we'll see that there's a main activity. So what is an activity? Basically, on Android, an activity is any screen that the user sees. For example, our app might have a main activity which will show all the notes that we've created, or it might have a delete activity which will allow the user to delete notes. So you'll see here that it's auto-generated a bunch of code which we don't really need, so we'll get rid of these fields and this, and we'll get rid of all the methods below onCreate. So the onCreate method is pretty much the starting point for any activity. It's the first first method that is executed when we start our activity. So you'll notice that on the first line it says setContentView r.layout.activity_main. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means that the app is going to look inside the resources folder, then the layouts folder, and then look for a file called activity_main. So as mentioned before, this is the main UI of the app. It's the thing that users are going to see when they first launch it. And since our UI is going to be a list of notes, we're going to replace the placeholder text that they've given us with a list view. And you'll see inside this list view, we've given a unique identifier, list_view, and we've given the layout width and layout height to both be match parent, which means it'll fill up the screen. So before we start the coding, if we stop and think how we're going to create this app, we probably think it's probably best if we created a notes class. So to do that, right-click the package name and go New Java class and call it Note. So here's a basic one that I made before. It's extremely basic with only two fields, title and ID, with the basic constructor that initializes both of them and the getters and setters for both of these fields. So before we get started, we're going to come implement the backend. And to do that, we're going to create a new class called Helper, which is basically going to be available to any of our other classes. So to begin, we're going to implement a method, a public static method returning a string that's called saveNote, which will take in a parameter of a note as well as context. Now you might be wondering what context is. Well, basically, context is an application. It allows an application to access application-specific methods, such as getting preferences or getting data saved by the app. In this instance, we're going to use something called shared preferences to save our data. To get an instance of it, we use Preference Manager to get the default shared preferences for our app. And since we'll be making changes to it, we'll need to get an instance of the editor to make edits. So once we can go here and go shared preferences.edit. Now how shared preferences works is it saves data in key value pairs. For example, if I get the editor, I can put a string with a key which is unique, such as a primary key in an SQL database, and the value, which is what I actually want to store in the database. And since ID has to be unique, we're going to use the current time of the system in milliseconds, and since this will always be unique, this will be a valid primary key for our system. So we'll be using a method called system.getCurrentTime in milliseconds. So the editor will put this inside our database with the primary key of ID, and we can go editor.commit to save it, and then return the ID to whoever calls this method. So the next method that we're going to implement is a method called getAllNotes, which will return every single note that we've saved into our system, which will once again take context so we can save our data and read our data. So we'll get a reference to shared preferences, which we just copied from up there, and we'll also create a new array list of notes. We'll call it notes equals new array list. So next we'll get a reference to every single value that is placed inside our shared preferences in an object called a map. So shared preferences.getAll. So basically maps allow you to see the keys and the values of every single item that is stored in the database. So let us loop every single value in our database. So we go map.entry and string, since we know that the key will be a string, and then we can go entry and every single one inside the entry set. So what we really want to do is get the saved data. So string saved data equals string entry dot get value. So we're getting the value from this particular one. Now if the saved data is not equal null, then we can create a new note out of this. Note equals new note with an ID of entry.getKey and a message of saved data. And of course we need to add this to our array list. Now of course this method has to return the array list, so we can just go return notes. So the next method we're going to implement is a method called removeNode. So we're going to go public static void remove node, which will take in the string ID, which is the ID we want to remove, and the context so we can make modifications to the saved data. So I've just copied some code from above, which allows us to get an instance of the editor. We can go editor.remove ID, which is the key, and then we can go editor.commit to save the data. So now we're done with the backend, we can finally start doing the front end in the main activity. So first here we'll declare a list view and try to get a reference to the list view that we created earlier in here. And we'll see that we've given it a unique ID list_view. So to reference that in code, we need to go list view equals, and since we know it's going to be returning a list view, we can cast it. We can go find view by ID, which is basically saying look inside our layout and find something with the ID of list view. So now we're going to implement a method called updateUI. It's basically a method that will refresh the UI to display the most up-to-date information that we have in our system. So before we get started, we need to create a new class which will define how our list view will be populated. Now this is called a list view adapter. So basically, a list view adapter is something that extends an array adapter that will take in a note for every single item we have in our list. And to import a constructor, we need to press Alt-Enter over this to press the create constructor method. And then after we do this, we can choose our constructor. We want one that takes in a list of notes. So we can just press that and you'll see that Android Studio has automatically generated our code. So next we're going to have to override a method called getView. And to do that, we can right click it and press override method. And then we can click getView here and press OK. And we'll see that Android has automatically overridden it. So here we can see three parameters: the position that we're trying to create, the view that we're going to use, and the parent that the view is a part of. So we're going to return convertView. So next we're going to have to inflate a new view, which will define how our list will actually look. So we'll go convertView equals layoutinflator.from, and we need, once again, we need an instance of our context, so we can go this.getContext, and we can go .inflate. So here we define the layout that we want to use. We want to use a predefined Android layout, so we can go android.r.layout.simple_list_item1. And we can pass in the parent and then pass in another false, which isn't too important right now. So next we're going to get the note that we actually need to put into this view. So this parent class has a method called getItem, which will allow us to get the item at a particular point. So we can go getItem and then type in position. So now that we've done that, we need to actually modify the list so it actually looks like what we want. So if we middle click on this, we'll see that our layout contains one text view with an ID of text1. So if we switch back to list view adapter, we can go text view title equals text view, and then use the same method as last time, find view.id, and since it's an Android ID, we have to go android.r.id.text1 as we saw before. And then from this, we can set text. So we can go title.setText note.getTitle, and we're done. We also need to make sure that the top of our list view is going to be a button that says add note. And to do that, we say if the position equals 0, we want to return a custom layout that isn't one of the default ones. So we copy this line from below and we make it return, and we make sure we modify the code so that it's giving us a new layout, which we haven't defined yet. So to define it, we right click our layout folder, we can go new layout resource, we call it new node, and we switch over to text, and we can write a text view. So basically this text view says we're going to set the text to be new node, we want the width to wrap the content of the text, we want the height to be 56 pixels, and we want the text to be in the middle of that list view. So now we can finally begin implementing our update UI method. And to do this, we need to get an array list of all the nodes that we've saved in our system, which luckily we have defined in our helper class. So we can just go helper.getAllNodes, context, we'll give it this, and we'll say, and since we know that the first node is going to be the add note button, we can add a dud entry in our first entry of our array list. So we'll just go new node, and we'll put in dummy data. So now we can finally set our list view to our new adapter that we defined before, list view adapter, with the parameters of context, and we can ignore this one since we're not using it, and the notes that we're passing in. So now if we want to see this on an actual device, we can go up here and press the play button on the WAR module, and you'll notice that our emulator has popped up. We can just press OK, and when it finally launches on, you'll see the UI that we've created here, with the new node button at the top. So the next thing on our list to do is to create functionality behind the add node button. So to do this, we need to set an item click listener, which is basically listening for whenever an item is clicked. So we create a new on item list click listener, and if position equals 0, i.e. if it's the first one, or the add note button, then we want to display speech screen. And basically, since Android Wear doesn't have a keyboard, we have to create our notes using speech. Display speech screen. Now this next bit of code is copied and pasted from the Android developer website, and you'll notice that intent, we're using something called intent. So basically an intent is used whenever you want to switch activities. It's something that provides data and context onto why and how you're switching activities. So here you're saying you want to switch to the recognizer action recognize speech activity that is predefined by Android, and you're putting in some extra data that says like language model freeform mode. Now you'll notice this method down here called start activity for result, which basically means I want to create an activity that will come back to me with a bunch of data that I need. We have to make sure we insert this extra line which will allow us to display a title when we want to recognize the speech. So to get the data back from this speech recognizer intent that we put out before, we need to implement a method called onActivityResult, which basically means when this activity comes back, I want to get the data from it. So if the request code matches the code that we used up here, 1001, and result code equals result okay, that means that it successfully returned with some data, we can start getting the data from this. So we can go list of strings called results equals data dot get string array list extra, and we can find where the data is stored by using recognizer intent dot extra results. Now the actual text is just stored in the first index of this array list. So string message equals results dot get the first one. So now we can create a new note from this. Equals new note with a null ID, since we don't know what it is yet, and a message. And then we can use our helper method to save our note using context, which is this, and then update the UI to reflect. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to implement an animation that will play whenever the user successfully creates a note. So here in our helper class, we're going to create a public static void method called display confirmation. It'll take in a string message, and it'll also take in context. Now this animation is played using a new activity that's predefined by Android called confirmation activity. So hence we must use an intent. In this intent, we can put some extra data like the animation type, which we want to be a success animation, and we also want to put in an extra message which is defined by our parameter. And here, of course, we're just starting our activity. Now, of course, before we can start doing this, we need to define our activity inside the Android manifest. So basically, the manifest is a place that shows every single activity and service that's running inside your application. So here we have to define our new confirmation activity. Here's the line that basically says we've got an activity that might be displayed that's called confirmation activity that's predefined by Android. Now to call this from our main activity class, we switch over to main activity and we go helper dot display confirmation with note saved exclamation mark and context. So the next step is to create a new activity that will allow our users to delete the notes from the application. So we'll create a new activity called delete activity, and we will delete the placeholder text that Android Studio has defined for us again in here and in here. Now to link this activity to our existing activity, we need to modify this method called onItemClick, which basically says when an item is clicked, let's open our new activity. So we go intent equals new intent, get application context, and delete activity.class. So we want to open our delete activity, and we want to pass in a few bits of data. So put extra, we want to put in an ID, note.getID. Now since we don't know what the note that we're trying to pass in yet is, so we can go note equals parent.getItemAtPosition, and then pass in the position that is selected up here, and cast it to note so the application knows that it's a note. Now the final step is starting the activity, which you can just do by calling start activity and then intent. Now let's have a look at the layout that we defined in delete activity. So if we middle click on it and we open it, we'll see an activity that I've created earlier. We've got a linear layout which displays things in a vertical list with the text view at the top and then a confirmation view at the bottom. Now you'll notice here that this delayed confirmation view, which we'll see later, references an item inside our drawable folder called ICCloseWhite, and since it doesn't exist yet, we need to import it into our project. So go over here, open your File Explorer and copy it into the drawable folder. And there you have it. There are some other attributes here which are pretty self-explanatory, talking about the color of the circle and how wide it is and the width of the border. So now that we've defined the layout, we can finally start referring to the delayed confirmation view in code. So if you're a bit confused about what a delayed confirmation view is, it's basically a big countdown timer that allows a user to cancel before an action is performed. In this case, we're going to delete the note. So delayed confirmation view equals, we'll use the findViewById method as last time, and we'll use the unique ID that's identified to it. Then we'll go delayed confirmation view.set total time. We want to give the user 3 seconds before it's executed, and then delayed confirmation view.start. Now how do we know if this delayed confirmation view has actually gone off? Well, to do that we need to implement a listener to this. So we've set the listener to this activity. And before we can actually register for these, we need to actually implement a few methods. So implements delayed confirmation listener. And if we press Alt Enter and we press implement methods, Android Studio will automatically populate these two methods. So basically this method is called whenever the timer is finished, and this method is called whenever the timer is selected and cancelled. So we'll start implementing this one first. The first thing we'll do is call the finish method, which will stop the activity. But before we do that, we need to make sure that we reset our delayed confirmation view so this method isn't executed. And finally, just as a sprinkle of animation, we'll go helper.displayConfirmation cancelled. Yes. Now this top method is when the animation actually gets to the end, and we want to delete the message. So the animations are very similar. We'll create a new animation that says deleted, but instead we'll get the ID that we were passed through the intent. So string ID equals get intent dot get string extra. As we defined before when we started this activity, we would be passing through a string ID with the key value of ID. So we're getting this ID, and we want to go helper.remove note ID. Now of course we need to remember to add in our context. So before we can launch this on our device, we need to make sure we implement something that will refresh the UI when we return to the main activity. And to do that, we're going to use a method called onResume. Now basically, this method is going to be called every single time something returns to the activity or the activity regains focus. So for instance, in our delete activity, when we return to main activity, we wanted to display the most up-to-date UI, so we'll call update UI in this. So now if we run it on our Android Wear device, so now we can see if we press test, it deletes the message when the timer reaches the end, and if we try to delete this and press the cancel button, it'll cancel.
Well, there you have it, guys, your very first wearables app. Thanks for watching. Hope you have a great day.